Professor Issing, thank you so much for joining us and speaking with Bloomberg on this occasion, the ECB turning 25 years old. You are, of course, one of the founding members of the ECB. I'd like to know about the first conversation that you had about joining the ECB. Who approached you? What was that conversation?
It's my pleasure to talk to Bloomberg at this occasion. And in this moment, as you can imagine, my memories go back to the first day and the first days and weeks and the time before. My first experience, so to say, with the ECB was when Bundesbank President Tietmeyer came to my office at the Bundesbank. I was member of the board and reported that his idea would be that I should become the first German in the executive board. And his reasoning was that nobody else as a German would get the fundamental responsibility for economics. And in the end, he convinced the Chancellor, which initially was very skeptical on my nomination because, as he told Tietmeyer, he asked Tietmeyer one day, has this Professor Issing ever said something positive on the euro? And Tietmeyer, as he told me later, said probably not. But finally, Tietmeyer convinced the Chancellor and the Finance Minister that nominating me would give much credibility to this position in the board.
And if you had never said anything positive about the euro, why did you take the job?
Good question. My brother, one of my brothers, he's an economist, asked me, Otmar, you were so critical. I was why did you finally join? And I said, this was a political decision. I was never against monetary union in Europe, quite the opposite. I was convinced in the end this continent should have common currency. But I was critical on the participation of, at that time, 11 countries, of which not all were well prepared. It was too early. This was my reservation. But the answer to my brother, and now the answer to you, is it was a political decision to start on 1st of January 1999. This decision was taken. So I was sure I should contribute to the success of the euro.
And what did you worry about most when you were in those discussions, when you sat down, going into this project, undertaking this experiment, really, in monetary experiment? What did you worry about most going into it?
As I said before, the heterogeneity of countries joining, stability culture has to be deserved, has to be developed, and my hope was this would, where it not had happened before, it would happen during participation in monetary union, but this hope has only been partially fulfilled.
And were there any risks that you thought might become a problem that were never really a problem when you were designing this and when you were looking at it?
And not only I think the concern of so many economists was we have a common currency as one central bank, and we have 19 sovereign countries with, in the end, sovereignty on fiscal policies. I think this is the challenge for the ECB until today.
And when you did take the job, you got, obviously, congratulations from a number of people, one among them Milton Friedman. What did he say to you?
I can say we had become friends years before, and among the many congratulations, his letter was on my desk. I opened it, and Milton said, "Dear Otmar, congratulations on an impossible job. I'm convinced the euro will fail. and then he added, but because of you, collapse might be delayed by some years.
And some years indeed, 25, we've made it so far. What do you think was the most dangerous moment for the euro? Was there ever a moment when you were observing it, either when you were there or afterwards, where you thought this may not work?
Of course, the beginning, because the international press, especially the Anglo-Saxon, was very critical. Imagine this ECB at the start in June 1998 had 400 staff. And the national central banks, at that time, 11 of them, 55,000. So they made a mockery up of our small institution. And you see the transition from 11 currencies to one has never happened before in history. This was really a unique event in history. And if you look on the data, statistical data, inflation expectations, long-term interest rates from December 98 to yet January 99, you will see no sign whatsoever. From the data, you would not recognize that an historical event has taken place. And especially in Germany, there was so much attention to the beloved DM, much beyond what is normal. Delors once said, not all Germans believe in God, but all Germans believe in the Bundesbank. This was on the one, it was mixed, so to say, on the one hand praise, on the other hand irony. So just to indicate what role the DM played in post-war Germany, and to give up the DM and accept new common currency, the euro, was a deep break in German, not only monetary history, it was deep felt in society. So to have a start like we had it was almost seen as impossible, but we managed it. And I think key was the development of a strategy which we announced, we at the ECB, already in October, mid-October 98. And if I may, to some extent, I was seen as, so to say, a kind of bridge from the stability of the Bundesbank to the ECB. It mattered much more than I had ever believed and thought of.
And what would you say is the biggest success of the euro to date for Europe? Put it into context into how significant you think it is.
The biggest success is, if you leave away the last 3 years, price stability, which is the mandate of the ECB. And giving speeches in Germany, I very often reminded the Germans that the annual average inflation rate in Germany during the period of 50-year period of the DM was 2.8, and for 20 years the annual average inflation rate for the euro was below 2%. So this promise has been fulfilled by the ECB. This was the most important contribution.
You probably know that you have something of a reputation as perhaps the ECB's original hawk. Do you think that's a fair designation, and what does it mean to be a hawk?
I always find this attribute given to me as a hawk, on the one hand strange, on the one hand consider for a moment, it helped when I proposed, for example, to reduce interest rates. When I, as an identified super hawk, made this proposal, there was no risk that the ECB or before the Bundesbank would be in suspicion not doing enough for the stability of the currency.
And how do you think running the ECB and running a central bank, the quality is important to doing that? How do you think that's changed from day one to day 25 years later?
Yeah, dramatically.
Yeah.
I was the only one fulfilling a first term of 8 years, full 8 years. And during my time from 98 to 2006, May 2006, when my term ended, So we conducted a kind of textbook monetary policy. I had written about that, published books on that. And more or less, of course, in very difficult times, we had no data available at the beginning. It was uncharted water, so many challenging situations. But in principle, it was a policy in relatively calm financial waters to keep the currency stable. This has changed first with the financial market crisis of 2007-8, later with the pandemic, now the attack of Russia on Ukraine. These are all events which are a big challenge for central banks because these events are coming from the outside.
And speaking of the financial crisis and the consequences of the financial crisis, two of them were quantitative easing and negative interest rate policy in some sense. These are things that were sort of experimental monetary policy techniques. Do you think that we will reflect on them as being successful?
I would distinguish three phases for quantitative easing. The first wave, immediately after the crisis, I think quantitative easing was successful, it was needed, and it had positive consequences. For the second phase, starting, let's say, 2014 around, in which it was more or less indifferent. And the last phase, in the last phase of quantitative easing, the negative consequences were dominating. Keeping too long in this situation of extremely low interest rates with abundant liquidity, the search for yield was dominating in markets because on safe investments you didn't get interest rates. So this is a situation in which the temptation to invest in risky assets is rising, and even normally ordinary people did that. So this created a situation which can be compared to the pre-crisis of 2007-8. The crisis later was different, but the situation of low interest rates, a period of very low interest rates, abundant liquidity is always creating a dangerous situation. So it's no surprise that we are now in a situation in which not only inflation has risen dramatically, mainly due to outside shocks, true, but at the same time the fragility of the financial system is emerging here and there, and this story is not yet over.
Well, this is what I was going to ask you. Nothing has broken yet. I mean, there have been cracks, but nothing is broken, I think it's fair to say. Do you think that there's still a risk of something breaking? Do you think that there are sort of these landmines within financial markets that are not clear to us?
You use the term landmines, this means you don't see it.
Yeah. By definition.
You don't see it, you recognize after it has exploded.
Yeah.
But you see this Silicon Valley Bank, for me it's unbelievable that regulators, supervisors did not intervene before. Because in a situation in which interest rates are rising, it's clear that safe assets like US government bonds will lose value. And if you can stand it until the end of maturity, then you have a liquidity problem. So this is not something new, but it was emergence of a risk well known since, I would say, centuries.
And do you think that governments over-rely on central banks for things, not just price stability, but growth, for example? Do you think that central banks have sort of accidentally walked themselves into a kind of trap where financial markets are so dependent on their actions and they're very much protagonists on the
I studied in central banking at the university, and I was, for 16 years, I was a central banker, Bundesbank, and later ECB. So I lived through a time when the reputation of central banks was raised to levels never seen before. Greenspan, for example, I have a book here, the title is Maestro. And central banks, when they saved the world from falling into depression after the financial crisis, in a depression in the dimension of 1931, they were called the saviors of the world. And on that basis, expectations in what central banks can deliver grew too much. In such a situation, experience should show, you know it from history, then the risk of decline is very close. And this overburdening of central banks with tasks, supervision, etc., financial stability, and also expectations from the public and not least from governments. With governments, it leads to a temptation, probably, for example, on fiscal policy, to be quite relaxed on deficits. Central banks will do it. Central bank will do it. And now this comes as a kind of revenge. And central banks themselves are, in my mind, to some extent guilty themselves. They have enjoyed this reputation in the public. I must confess, I loved it too. Yeah. If you come as a central banker and say, "Oh, these are most important people in the world," which we were not, and this impression should not prevail, but it was existent.
And the question is now, what choice do they have? If they've been handed this, the economy, or in some way being the stewards of the economy, they can't very well just put it down, right? So what is the way out of that?
No, of course, they have to keep to their mandate, etc., and continue with policy, but they should have warned, they should have said, at a time when everything goes well, it's difficult to explain what the policy can do and what it cannot do. And this, what we cannot do, was almost missing in messages from central banks at that time. Central banks over time cannot keep unemployment low. It's a combination of wage policy, government policies, etc. Central banks can contribute by keeping the value of the money stable, but I think they have missed to teach the lesson.
Are you at all reassured by some of the things you've seen from the United States, from Europe, in terms of industrial policy and those sorts of things? Do you think that is moving in a good direction?
I don't think so. This new policy is connected with protectionism. This is very bad for the world. And the US it started with Trump, but it has continued with Biden. And the EU was always exposed to this danger of creating a fortress Europe. And just now identifying sectors in which we will invest so much public money, I think in the end will create many malinvestments.
And in terms of the German economy, very few people have studied it as deeply and for as long a period of time as you have. What do you think are the biggest threats to German competitiveness, to the economy in the sort of next 5 to 10 years that really worry you?
For me, Germany is at a turning point. I think a thoughtful journalist, she once said, Germany in the past has outsourced the security to the US. Its energy imports to Russia. And its economic situation exports to China. And if you look now in all these three sources of past success, you see how the world is changing for Germany. It's changing anyway for every country in the world. Globalization, the speed of globalization has come to an end. The whole environment is changing. China has emerged as a dominating. We have war, etc. Demography plays a major role everywhere. Shrinking working population, and all these aspects hurt Germany, especially because it's export-oriented economy. Take the car industry, German car industry. I think Germany produced the best cars in the world. Was dominating, not dominating, was a major player in car markets in the world. But now with the carbon time coming to an end on electrification, Germany is certainly not the leader. So, and this is an industry which has created so many jobs, not only in the car industry, but along the production line. And this was the industry where the highest wages were paid. Yeah? So Germany is rapidly growing, look at me, and shrinking.
And today, what would you say is the biggest threat to the euro?
I have an article back on my bookshelf with the headline, "The Damocles Sword over the euro area," or the euro. And the Damocles Sword is the high debt in Italy, increasing debt in France. This has to be solved.